think I think it's okay to maybe start 2 minutes late. I think 2 minutes is a very sort of respectable sort of lateness. That allows people to kind of like arrive as well. So give me.
We can be a bit loose with, like, if we're talking for longer on the questions, we can have shorter
Yes,
questions from the audience period and stuff like that, I think.
for sure.
Oh yeah, that's a good idea.
We've been quite generous with that amount of time.
Okay, I think what I'll do, if it's okay with the three of you, is I'll just keep like a light track of time. Since there are 30 minutes, 40 minutes of open conversation, it kind of makes it around 5 minutes per question. Is that right? Five and a bit minute per question. So I think what I'll do is just kind of keep a light track, and if maybe I can even just sort of set a little timer, and when there's a minute left, I'll just go like that or something. Does that sound okay?
Yeah, that's
Okay.
really
So if you go over, I'm not gonna like go like that or anything. I'll just let you, but if you can just nod or just give me a thumbs up when I give you the 1 minute signal like that, then I know you've acknowledged it, and you can just sort of go as long as you want after that. I'm not gonna like, step in again, because sometimes, you might just want a little extra time, and we can shorten some other questions as well. I think I'll eat after, babe. Thanks. Matt's just coming with this lovely plate of food. I was skateboarding today, Chris. First skateboarding lesson. So I came home kind of late and just kind of scrambled up. So I'm still kind of settling in the space. But yeah. Okay, so back to focus. Anything that we should touch on first before we let people in? Anything else?
I think we're good.
Yeah.
Oh, good. Rose, you feel okay too? Yeah. Oh, lovely. Fantastic. So on that note, I think I'm gonna let people in. We've got 16 people in the waiting room. Lovely. I'll admit them all then.
Does he put the traders and customers there?
Hi, everybody. As you enter the space, can I just ask if you could turn off your videos and your sound to start with? We'll have some time at the end of the conversation where we can invite participation, but in the first instance, it would be great if you could turn cameras and sound off. Thanks. We're also going to be recording the session so that it's available online later as a free resource. So I'm just letting you know that in case that's something that they need to know. I'm just going to give people another minute or so to come into the space. So yeah, we'll start at, according to my computer clock, 7:05. So thanks. Okay, it's 7:05. I think I'm just going to start. Hello, everybody. I'm Sunshine. I'm co-director of program at Bloc Projects. Thank you, everyone, for taking the time tonight to have this conversation with us, to listen in to this event, which is called Access to Grief. And tonight we have the two artists whose work we're showing at Bloc Projects. I know they're waving in their frame. That's Emily Simpson and Chris Alton. And joining them is also Jhinuk Sarkar. Jhinuk, you can wave as well. Who is also an artist and a facilitator. And finally, we have Rose Grover, who is going to be our technical support tonight. Thank you, Rose. Thank you, everyone, for coming tonight. So before we let the artists talk about the project and all the intricacies of that, I'll just do a few bits of housekeeping. So like I mentioned at the beginning, this conversation is going to be recorded and put online later as a resource. We are going to be looking at 6 kind of key questions that the conversation is going to be framed around tonight, and I will be kind of keeping track of time in doing that. We are going to have a good half hour at the end for open discussion, which I hope is like a generous amount of time for us to kind of, hear your thoughts as well on the topic. And an important thing as well is that we want to set certain boundaries for tonight's conversation. Because we are touching on quite a volatile subject, grief, people are welcome to leave the room at whenever and re-enter if you like. We would, welcome you back, of course. And we are talking primarily about living with loss rather than the situations in which you might have lost someone, because these sort of situations, these circumstances of how people died can be quite triggering. So I'd like to remind people to be mindful of that and not bring that up and in part of this conversation. And finally, if you have any comments or questions or ideas, our chat is going to be our collective notebook, I suppose, and I'm going to be using that as well. I'm quite an avid note taker, so I'll be typing in that space, and hopefully it will be helpful for all of us to reference and to keep track of interesting points that are brought up in the conversation. So I encourage you to use that space, the chat space, for that. So I think those are the main things, and I'm going to introduce the speakers first, and then I'll kind of frame the first question, and then we'll hand it over to them. So I'm going to start with Emily. Emily is an artist, a curator, and workshop facilitator. Their work looks at love, lulls, and loss, explored through textiles, writing, zines, events, printmaking, and curation, amongst other things. And Chris Alton is an artist as well, based in Manchester. His practice spans a range of media and approaches, including socially engaged projects, video essays, textile banners, and publications. Each of his projects addresses an array of interconnected social, political, economic, and environmental concerns. And last but not least, Jhinuk Sarkar is an illustrator and educator living in London. Alongside their creative practice, they work as an access consultant and co-produce the Square Hole podcast that explores neurodiversity in the creative industries. So those are our 3 lovely speakers. And the first question that we're going to be looking at, actually, before we do that, Chris and Emily, sorry, I was reading, so I didn't notice that you were probably waving at me. Sorry about that. I'll give you some time to maybe just share some images and some ideas behind the project first, and before jumping into the questions. Sorry about that.
Cool. So hi, yeah, I'm Chris, and
I'm Emily.
and we're just going to run through 8 or 9 images and say a little bit about them, so that those who haven't had the chance to see the exhibition or weren't able to attend the workshops that we hosted, or haven't seen the publication, just know a little bit about the activity that we're going to be kind of talking in relationship to. So first up, this project was very much workshop led, I suppose, gathering led, and we hosted different grief related sessions for people with lived experience of grief, to come together and talk about that. And each session had a different, almost creative element to it. So what you can see here is one from a sewing kind of making based workshop, where we were inviting participants to make a almost Victorian style mourning patch in relationship to someone that they loved who had died, who they were grieving for. And we also hosted a dinner and a kind of active listening session. For the dinner, people were invited to bring a dish to share that had been previously cooked by or associated with someone they love who died. And for the active listening one, people were invited to bring along a song to share in a similar kind of vein.
So this is one of the worksheets that we used for all of the workshops, and we kind of sent these to people prior to the workshops so they could kind of mentally get in the right headspace, and be a bit prepared for the content as well. So it includes these open-ended questions about what grief feels like, what living with loss feels like, and yeah, throughout all of the project, we were trying to like feel out gaps in the English language for communicating loss and grief, and this was informed by our like shared experiences of just feeling like there's not enough capacity to communicate loss within language on basic levels, like the stuff that, like for example, my dad is no longer alive, but my mum is. We have the word orphan if you've lost 2 parents, but none for just one. We have the word widow, but nothing else. And language shapes our capacity to experience the world, but also for other people to understand us. So yeah, we kept on returning to this idea of trying to feel out gaps in the English language, where language could inhibit experience, or where more language could protect, shelter, and comfort experience in some way.
Yeah, so that relationship to language has been a kind of overarching interest, and that's kind of explored in quite a lot more detail in publications that we've put together. The one with the kind of golden leaves was made as part of this project. You can buy a copy at cost price from Bloc Projects. They're £3, but you can also access a digital copy for free via Bloc's website. And the one with the kind of turquoise teardrops is from an earlier stage in this project, probably about 2 years ago now. And inside these publications, as well as finding writing that we've kind of done together, collections of reflections from the different workshops and gatherings, there are also things like this. So this is a recipe from Sunshine, actually, who attended one of the dinners.
Don't quite know what to call it, dinner gathering.
Yeah.
Potluck dinner.
Shared meal, yeah. But all of those kind of activities, those gatherings, they were feeding into what we would make for the exhibition space at Bloc. And we didn't necessarily know what we were going to do at the beginning of this. We had a sense. Jhinuk's role in this will become kind of more apparent, because our conversations with her certainly shaped how we were thinking about the spaces that we were making, and this work is definitely an echo or a continuation of that kind of thinking. So I'm just going to flick through a couple of images. So one from the entrance.
So the words, so what you can see is obviously a large textile canopy which fills the gallery space of Bloc Projects. Some people have described it as like a womb, a bit like kind of tent-like, a bit like those dens that you make when you're a kid. And it stemmed from this idea of language being a shelter, and we wanted to create this kind of hold space and create this environment within the gallery where these conversations about loss and grief could be held and cushioned and facilitated. The words that you can see are all gathered from the workshops. So they're not direct quotes, they're kind of amalgamated quotes that people have said, common ideas that people have returned to about their differing experiences of living with loss.
Yeah, and then I think, yes, great. So instead of doing like an exhibition floor plan, sort of giving information about all the different works, we realized it was necessary to make a kind of plan view of the canopy, because it's not necessarily easy for everybody to read all of the words that are kind of above their heads, and it's actually been quite nice to see people moving around the space differently and sort of angling themselves differently so that they can take it all in. But that's not necessarily something that everyone can or wants to do. So we also produce this. So it's super useful in a context like this as well, because we can actually show you all of the different phrases that are part of it, and you can get a sense of what's going on, which is kind of impossible with the pictures. Mm-hmm. So we're going to stop sharing there, and we'll kind of get on with the prepared questions, I think.
We should say as well, like Jhinuk, have we mentioned Jhinuk was, so we had two people that supported us throughout this project. One was Joshua Hart, who is an artist and also an art psychotherapist, and was present for all the workshops. And then we had Jhinuk, who is here to talk to us tonight and was our accessibility consultant, and also kind of talked through ideas with us.
Yeah, we didn't quite understand how integral Jhinuk was going to be at the very beginning of the project, but yeah, it can't understate the the value of having you to talk things through with, and it really shifted our perspective, I think.
Yeah, thank you for that lovely introduction. It just sort of gives people, hopefully, who have not visited the gallery yet or been able to attend the workshops, some idea of the scope of the project and what has been produced in the last year and a bit, actually. So I think let's start with the first question. We've got 6 of them, and what I'll try and do is kind of keep, because there's limited time, I'm going to try and just keep a gentle track of each question. So what I'll do is kind of raise my finger like this when we are about 1 minute away from having to ask the next question. But yeah, I'm just letting people know, so you understand why I'm kind of putting my finger up. It's not to ask a question. All right, so the first question we're going to be exploring is what barriers to talking about grief are there in society? Okay.
Take the lead on this one then. So as we took, I think something that the project stemmed from this feeling between me and Chris that we didn't really have permission to talk about what we'd been through, or we felt resistant to talking about grief. And part of that was through, like I'd mentioned before, like this lack of language and vocabulary, not having the word to describe your experience and who you are within that experience. But part of it is just, it's like culturally, in Britain anyway, not really discussed very openly. And there's a lot of kind of shying away from uncomfortable conversations and conversations about mortality and end of life. So I think we'd both experienced that, but throughout this process and talking to other workshop participants,
So I think there's a phrase in the canopy which is something along the lines of "time is a healer is a slap in the face," and I kind of mention this one because there are these sort of like social expectations that like time heals all wounds, and I think when I was, when my mum first died and I was experiencing like this really substantial grief for the first time, I was under this like false impression that it was going to heal, that it was going to get better, that it would eventually go away. So I think one of the barriers is these kind of misconceptions and these things that are kind of said to be true, but in experience they really aren't, and they can kind of set you up, I suppose, with false expectations.
You both answered it really well. I don't know if I need to answer any more, except I think around the language idea, there feels like there's lots of different perspectives on the language that can, go even further to presenting barriers, not just culturally, but like in different scenarios or different, I can't remember when it was, but we talked about different types of grief as well, that they might not be about the loss of another person. It might be a loss of part of yourself with losing that person, or I think there's a phrase on the canopy that says, "Can I still call myself a parent if I no longer have a child?" And yeah, so I think in different situations, how language can be used in different ways, that was something. But I think, where's the etiquette as well? Like, what's right and what's wrong? You kind of lose the sense of where those boundaries are, and I think that can present a massive barrier to even talk about it, and then you just don't talk about it.
Totally, yeah. People don't want to say the wrong thing, or they don't want to bring up a difficult subject because they don't want to make you sad.
Yeah.
Reality is you're thinking of that person all the time, just like you did when they were alive.
Yeah, and sometimes you want to talk about that person as well, and it might not be in sad ways as well, and that feels like a barrier. Like, maybe anytime that you mention them or speak of them, it feels like an unsaid word that you shouldn't really mention because you're supposed to be sad about it all the time, but maybe there's something joyous that you want to talk about, and the boundaries of that feel a bit like a barrier.
Yeah.
I don't know. But aside from language, I think there were other things, weren't there, that maybe that bleeds into other questions coming up, but things that remind you of them that aren't language, like spaces or time passing or different senses. I think all those things feel like, oh, I might have to avoid that space. That becomes a different type of barrier. I don't know. That makes sense? You guys?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's just quite resonant because when looking at the canopy and you see all of these different words, and sometimes people don't see the full sentence, so they just pick out like the one word. Like yesterday we had an interview with BBC Radio Sheffield, and the presenter just read out "the face" or "suddenly," and when you take on that, whoops, that was my timer. When you take on that phrase or just that segment of the supposed full sentence, it also kind of like and I use trigger in a more in a broader way, by the way. It triggers like lots of different things. It can, and it just sort of shores up it feels what the three of you seem to be saying, which is sort of like the strange balance between like etiquette, the gaps in the language, you know, all of these things that produce these obstructions to a more to the possibility of engaging with these things. So maybe this leads to our second question, which is, can the creative process make it easier to talk about grief? I'll hand it over to you.
Yeah, we certainly tried. I think, well, it certainly made it easier to talk about grief when we invited people into the room who had all kind of been through it, or were living with grief, and the invitation was like very, very specific, so people knew what they were kind of coming along for. And as Em mentioned earlier, we sent out questions and prompts ahead of time, so people understood what they were coming for and what was going to be asked. But I also think that the different activities that we were doing had a role, because we weren't just in the room to talk about living with grief and what that experience was like for us. We were also there to sew, to share food, to share music. Yeah, I didn't necessarily realize it at the very start when we were kind of planning these things, but those things actually were very, very important. Yeah,
I think they definitely acted as a softener for the conversations, having something bodily to do, and something productive to do. I think whether it's through creativity or other outlets, having that kind of bodily productive relationship to grief where you're actively working on it and tending to it, is something that I've really learned from this process, is definitely helpful to me. There was a phrase from one of the workshops about tending to my grief just like a garden, which really resonates with me. Yeah, I think like using it and discussing it in a creative way has definitely allowed me to hold space for it within my life, and kind of own up to it, live with it, and also in some ways kind of like be proud of it, instead of shying away from it, being proud that I can have these conversations and own grief as part of my identity. Yeah.
I think this is going to be what I do, is to think about the last question and add more to it to think about this question.
That's good as well.
I was thinking about another barrier being like the privilege to sort of say and express, and maybe some people have a privilege to like address it in their creative process where others can't or don't have the language to. And I think one wonderful thing that you both did was to sort of invite people through participation to be a part of that creative process where they might not have been able to do it on their own, and it was like a collective force. So you kind of did something in your creative process to remove that barrier, which was really nice. And I think, I don't know if this maybe sounds a bit cheesy, like that you gave them tools to like express their grief in ways that they hadn't explored before, which I think from, I don't know, the way that they responded and participated felt like a positive thing for most involved. Because I think, you know, you did lots of different activities that were creative in different ways, not just drawing, for example. It was making, it was listening to music, it was listening to each other, maybe expressing through movement as well, which, you know, all feels like not your obvious thing that you think of when you think about handling or tending to your grief, like you say. Because, you know, if you look up how to process grief, there's probably something like, I think there is, isn't there, 5 stages of grief or something like that, and it feels very rigid, and maybe not everyone can do that so easily because we're just human, aren't we?
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, that stage kind of stages thing of grief, I don't know heaps about it, but again, it's one of those kind of cultural misconceptions where anyone who's grieving is perhaps expecting themselves to conform to these 5 stages, but as far as I'm aware, they are written in relationship to a person who themselves is going to die. So they are grieving for their own life, and they are going through those stages towards acceptance. But it's such a kind of bite-sized, easy to understand sort of thing that it very quickly gets like applied to other types of grief. But yeah, did you have something you were going to say?
Oh, I've forgotten it now. But adding on to what you've just said, I think one of the things I've learned through speaking to so many people in this project and having their really generous insights is like grief is just such a undefinable, unquantifiable, like strange, surprising experience, full of like all of the shades in all the world, just like yeah, like it's so non-specific that I think, kind of like Jhinuk was saying, having different outlets, not just creativity as well, but you know, like talking therapy, I don't know, for me it's, after this I'm going to be like going on lots of hikes and stuff like that. I think having lots of different strings to your bow and different outlets, creative and other, is kind of the only way of approaching something that's so strange and changing.
Yeah, the fact that grief is strange and changing, that is quite that came across quite a bit, I think, in this project as well, especially during the workshop period, when I remember that very quickly your workshops would sell out of tickets, but then on the day, like maybe just a portion of the people would show up, and I just remember like, I think it is that thing where like there is a desire so often to want to explore this, you know, oh my gosh, this opportunity, you know, I really want to talk about this. And then the day might come and it's like, it's not the right place, time, all of these things. But for those who did attend, that, you know, I've been to all of the workshops, full disclosure here, but and it just felt like such an inviting space. So I guess leading to the next question, how exactly did you invite others into a conversation about grief?
That's where our conversations with Jhinuk became really key, because I don't think until we'd spoken to Jhinuk we'd considered so seriously, like we knew there was a big responsibility about inviting people into that space, but I think we hadn't considered how the intention that we set from the start was really important, and how we should guide people through the experience even before they'd got through the door. So, you know, you'll be able to expand upon this yourself, but I remember you talking to us in quite a lot of depth about like just what the Eventbrite page would look like, in terms of like how the language could kind of offer insight and a little bit of generosity to the space before we'd got there.
Yeah, you got us to be incredibly specific, so that the Eventbrite was sort of saying like, oh, this is, you know, this is what we're going to be doing, but you know, this is the kind of area that we're going to be focused on discussing. It was just super detailed, not only with that kind of written sort of advert / invitation, but you were also saying to us like, okay, well, let's talk about the temperature of the space. What's the lighting going to be like? what does the temperature and the lighting of the space say about, you know, the context that you're kind of creating?
Yeah.
In what manner are you going to ask questions? If you're working with textiles, have you considered sorting the textiles by their texture? Are you going to sort them out into colour? Because, you know, we run a lot of textile workshops and we are rocking up with a bag of nonsense. You know, we'd never thought to ourselves like, oh yeah, maybe it'd be like super useful for people to have like different colours kind of laid out and different textures laid out. Not only is it practical, but as you kind of said to us, people who are going to have like a kind of sensory sort of kind of issue with some of these things can far more easily avoid that.
Yeah.
If everything's laid out, it just makes it so much easier for people. And, you know, when you're asking people to come into a space and talk about living with grief, which is, you know, going to be one of the more difficult, more emotionally charged and challenging areas of their life, you've got to really think about how can we kind of soften the edges of this as much as possible.
Yeah, can you offer them a cup of tea, biscuits? Is the space going to be warm? Because being sad makes you feel cold. I hadn't put two and two together with that until you pointed it out.
Yeah. Well remembered. Like, oh yeah, we did talk about all those things. But I also liked how then it formed like your creative vision of what would come next, or how you might piece those bits together. And correct me if I'm wrong, a workshop before that, the kind of around sharing a meal, that was with mostly people that you knew, but then the second one with the textiles was inviting a more public kind of inviting. So there was a nuanced difference there as well, like your relationship to those people in each workshop would be different, and making them feel comfortable and open and brave as well, I guess, to express themselves in the way that they wanted to kind of think or act or speak about their grief, felt really important for you to consider how you might respond to every type of reaction that we could possibly think of between us beforehand.
Having those conversations, having Josh there, the art therapist, was really useful. Even though his help wasn't explicitly needed, I think it was quite a grounding experience for everyone in the room to know that he was there.
Was for me.
Yeah. And we also, we both took mental health training, so mental health first aid and introduction to counselling, which helped me think about language differently, in terms of like being more conscious about using some of those counselling skills, like congruence, leaving silence, and yeah, it changed my role as a facilitator, because often as an artist facilitator, you're kind of this bubbly, high energetic person that's like saying that's amazing all the time. But it had to be a lot more conscious than that, and a lot more gentle than that.
And I think it's also worth mentioning that we didn't get everything right. We weren't able to follow Jhinuk's guidance to the absolute letter at all times. You know, we're working on a limited amount of money with a limited amount of time and resource. And there were also things we just didn't foresee. You know, one of the workshops, it was pointed out to us very early on that in terms of like getting into the building and finding the space and stuff, we needed to think about that more. So for the next workshop, we were prepared with, here's a photo of the building, here's the route that you're going to be taking up to the space. You know, it was stuff that unfortunately we couldn't really have thought about or known about without hindsight, but once we did know, we were able to do something about it. And I guess like that's part of this as well. It's like, you're not always going to get it right. Like, this is a general kind of grief lesson I've certainly learned through this project. It's like, you've got to just kind of give it a go, be willing to kind of get it wrong, but also kind of adapt and you know, figure out what is right through doing, as opposed to doing nothing.
I would say that's something to do with access as well. You know, you're not always going to get it right, or you're not always going to be able to include everything. We were talking before everyone joined about limitations just purely by budget. You know, we can't always do everything, but being responsive and listening to those that are engaging with what you do means a lot to people, I think. So on the grief front and access front, I think, yeah, feeling heard and having a conversation, understand, so that on both sides there's understanding about why there's limitations, or actually I hadn't realized that, but you've taught me something and now I'm going to respond to it by, you know, preparing in a certain way next time. I think that feels valuable to everyone involved. So yeah, I think
we definitely, the first gathering that we did, which was the dinner, we learned from one of the people who came, who we'd reached out to people the next day to check in on them and say thank you, and he got back to us saying that he'd had a really meaningful, productive time that he was really grateful for, but he felt drained, and so did we, but I really appreciated him telling us how tired it had made him, because we hadn't considered that like moment of aftercare before, and how, like, although it might have been an uplifting experience in the present, there's an emotional backlog with all of these things, and yeah, he said, so we then built that into the workshops going forward, to try and get people to think of something they could do, like something gentle they could do to care for themselves afterwards, like going on a walk or eating your favorite food or something like that.
Yeah, just asking people to be mindful that they may feel somewhat depleted that evening, the next day, etc. Like, just to kind of forewarn and encourage some kindness to themselves if that were to come up. Yeah. Sunshine, I think you may have the next question ready for us. Give us a few gestures.
I gestured a few times. That's okay, because I feel like you've already kind of answered the question I was going to pose anyway, which was how were emotions considered of participants and audience and yourselves as facilitators? And because I guess the two questions of invitation and of emotions are intrinsically linked anyway. When you're inviting someone in, you're holding them in a space, you're thinking about how they're going to react and respond within the space. And you've, you know, all three of you very eloquently and through quite concrete examples of like how to, even talking about the temperature and the textures of the space. Those are very sort of like specific things that you have considered throughout the project. And maybe spilling over to the next question then is, did you consider the sensory experience of the exhibition? I think it'd be quite interesting now to maybe shift a little bit, if we may, shift gears to look at the exhibition as well, to think of what that as resulting from all of these workshops. But you know, I just putting that in there, and we can very well still bring the workshops in and all the other thought processes to it. But yes, how did you consider the sensory experience of the exhibition?
It's almost a tricky one, because I suppose with the work, we didn't really know how it was going to look, or how it was going to be within the space. We could imagine it, but that sewn textile work, it is 9.15 meters by 7.5 meters. and we simply didn't have a space where we could lay the whole thing out. Like we have a studio which has like a gallery as part of the group of studios, but that gallery was too small to lay it out. Bloc is too small to lay it out. So we were imagining and sort of picturing the kind of ideal in terms of hoping that the space would be soft, would be warm, would be inviting, would be light enough so that people could sit and read, but not so bright that anyone was dazzled or anything like that. So there were very much things that we were aiming for, many of which we have very fortunately managed to achieve, but we weren't necessarily able to plan it all. I suppose we used a lot of calico, which really softened a lot of the lighting, gave it a kind of warm glow and that kind of thing. So that was something that was planned. And I suppose our choices of colours have certainly had an effect in terms of how people will kind of respond to the space and kind of feel within the space. And you were very particular about the colours.
Oh yeah, I was like adamant that we weren't going to be using black and red because I was emo as a teenager and I didn't want it to look like a My Chemical Romance album cover, even though they're still one of the best bands. But yeah, we wanted to get away from some of the kind of more gloomy looking visuals because we wanted to create a space with lots of different shades, a space that's kind of lighter, airier, more inviting, because there's already a barrier to people wanting to go through that door and deal with death. So you have to invite them in with a bit of warmth and colour and yeah. So the colours we tried to go for non-specific colours as well, which we didn't always hit because we were working with what was available, and we used like a kind of recycled fabric place. So, but yeah, we were trying to go for non-specific colours, like teals and burgundies and stuff like that, that would have a bit of that kind of conceptual imagery of the non-specificity of grief as well. But certainly when we spoke to Jhinuk as well, we'd spoke about the sensory aspects and wanting it to be a bit like a den and stuff like that, but also have that childlike experience. And we were trying to think of ways that we could incorporate that into the installation without having people kind of touching it too much, because it's also an artwork. And we all have
we talked about that, didn't we? About whether you wanted people to touch it or not, and how if people felt compelled to touch it, you might have other ways for them to access it. And so that's where the same material was used on the benches, which
there is that compulsion to touch things.
Oh, totally. I spent so many years as the please don't touch it police. And
I'm always the person that touches things when people aren't looking. But yeah.
So yeah, it's preferable to to have the cushions and that sort of thing all done with the same fabric and the same techniques, so people will have the same kind of sensory experience from touching those as they would from the canopy, but also if they touch the canopy, it's kind of okay. I'd prefer it if you didn't, but I'm not going to tell you not to.
Yeah. It's covered in plastic anyway from sewing at home.
Yeah, and I don't know if I remember thinking about this, but I don't know if we had a conversation about it. But I think what's lovely about what you've achieved in the space with the work is that the colours, they do feel soft and inviting, but you've managed to combine them in ways that don't that don't remind people of specific things like what you were saying before about bands, or I was thinking about flags as well, because I didn't, I wanted it to not be, a barrier that, they see a certain color combination that it might, mean something to someone. So I think you achieve that really well as well. And when I came to visit it, it was on the private view night, and it was so dark outside, but warm and inviting as well, and soft in that way. And the lighting, there was a kind of glow behind the calico, which was really, I don't know if you planned it, but that was
The lighting was less planned than we would.
I know you envisaged it, but
a lot of the lighting was down to needing people to simultaneously read the publication, so needing specific lighting so that people can read, but also if the canopy is lit from above and Bloc has overhead lighting, all you can see is the seams and all of the threads that we've not trimmed off. So we had to like light it quite carefully, which accidentally created this kind of nice, cozy, almost like room-like atmosphere. But
I was adamant it was going to work from the start. I was terrified. Lighting it was a really, really big challenge, and we are very, very fortunate that it worked out with regard to Bloc's overhead lighting, and that we were able to kind of achieve that lovely glow. There's a kind of stained glass effect on one of the areas. But yeah, like I think it's also important to say, like this work, it's part of this like wider trajectory within the project, where it's been about making spaces that I suppose are, I suppose, conducive to feeling like sheltered, to feeling supported. So it's very much a continuation, like metaphorically, I suppose.
We tried to use the language that we use in the publication and in the exhibition, kind of text and communication about the exhibition. We tried to use as like plain and simple as language as possible, as well, just because grief is, again, such like a convoluted, complicated experience that we don't need to complicate it further with like sticky language, which could potentially be alienating.
And you know the sound, because I see that in the chat, the sound of the space probably was quite pleasant to be in on a busy private view night, because it was sort of softened by all the fabric in the space. So it did a nice job of doing that practically for itself. I'm not sure how I'd respond to smell of the space. I know we talked about it with the meal, but yeah.
Yeah, I think we didn't want to smell in particular because it could be evoke unpredictable things.
I think the smell that we've ended up with is that of calico and cotton and that kind of thing. I don't know if I could necessarily describe it. I'm not. We met a kind of like smell specialist a few weeks ago. Like his job, he's kind of like a perfumier kind of guy. He was working with an artist friend of ours. But yeah, I'm not so able to describe the nuances of smell. But in terms of sound, it definitely softens any kind of echoing and so on. It's definitely not as echoey or cavernous as galleries sometimes can be.
Yeah, working in the gallery, I can definitely vouch for the fact that it does have a very soft feeling, and the smell of calico and cotton kind of reminds me of going to like a fabric place or some kind of furniture place, like just being in sort of like a domestic kind of environment almost. But if I can just sort of clarify, the answer to that is like it wasn't like you designed any kind of smell or sound for the work, was there? It's just sort of the main output, I suppose, from all of these workshops were the publication, all the words that were chosen and put onto the canopy with the seating and the publication. So I hope that answers your question, Kath. So the final question that we have here is, where and how does creativity and accessibility meet, and what lines are blurred?
A big question, isn't it? Sorry, I think I wrote that one.
Would you like to take it then?
It's your forte.
Sure. I just think that it was interesting from our conversations that we started off with a very practical criteria to consider that had many facets to it, because, you know, there were some things that were barriers that were invisible and some that were very obvious to address. But what ended up happening was quite fun to think about and creative, and I don't know, maybe led you to think about it, you know, ongoing and where it could go next, which you'll probably talk about later. But I definitely think over the last few years, I've met lots of creatives that get some kind of stimulus from thinking about accessibility or inclusivity and trying to remove the barriers to their work. And I'm very interested to hear about the perfumia that you know about, because that's something that I'm thinking about more and more as well, like how to translate one sense into another in my practice. And I think it comes from having built up a bit of a bank of experiencing different artists approach accessibility in different ways depending on their art form. And I think it's just yeah, it provides a stimulus, and that's where the lines get blurry. I think they feed each other in a way.
Yeah, totally. It certainly was the same for us, as we've kind of, I suppose, alluded to already. The things that we were speaking about with Jhinuk with regard to the workshops that we were then putting into practice then took on, I suppose, not only a metaphorical role, but a practical role when we started to think about the artwork in the space and that kind of thing. So yeah, there's been a huge amount of blurring between what is a creative decision and what is an access decision. I suppose, you know, there are also areas where it's not particularly blurry at all. The publication, for instance, is a quite particularly designed object with 12 point type and that kind of thing, and it's, you know, it's printed. It's there, so we've got that as the kind of art object. But then there are different permutations of it. There's a large print version. There's a version that's printed on dyslexia-friendly paper. There is a digital version that is screen reader friendly. So whilst those ones are not the art object, it's you know, let's not get into that, but they are versions that aren't as heavily designed or as considered as the publications. And you know, maybe this is something that we will be thinking about further going forwards. You know, how can we make something that is as well considered and, you know, on really nice paper and this, that, and the other, which is, if not for everyone, is as carefully as considered as each other for a broad spectrum of people who have different needs when it comes to accessing the written word.
I think it's worth saying as well that there was a lot more in terms of access that we wanted to do, but just failed to do because we ourselves just ran out of capacity. Because we were dealing with not only this creating the exhibition, doing the workshops, but like managing our own grief and emotions alongside of that. So there were just points where we had to just kind of go, although we would like to have done this, we can't. We need to just switch off for a bit. yeah, I guess like this is one of the questions we've got later, but I'll touch upon it a little bit now. Just like going forward, I think like it's that blurring between our needs and embedding our own access needs into the project more heavily, I think, is something that we will have to consider more, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think we've been super, super fortunate to work with you, Sunshine, because even though we haven't stated a lot of our quote unquote access needs, you have been able to intuit it really, really well. You've been so wonderful to work with, and we're really grateful for that. And Jhinuk, from the very beginning, you also kind of said to us, well, we're talking a lot about accessibility in this project, but you haven't mentioned yourselves once. So it was really welcome, and we're very grateful for you to sort of turn the question around on us as well. So yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I think it goes back to, I think, something we said earlier about even though there's lots of things we all want to do, being open and realistic about what we have capacity to do is just really valued when it's just openly said or explained. And I think generally people around you who are listening to that totally get that perspective, because we all have our own capacities and organizationally as well as individually, there are some organizations that have capacity to do more and some that don't, and I think being honest about their positions is always welcome from their visitors, and then they can prepare how they engage with the space. That I think that Bloc Projects is such a nice, warm, inviting space, and there's lots of resource on the website as well that supports what you do in the space. I think that's what's really great about that. But, yeah.
Oh, thanks. It's also been I think we had when we were preparing for this conversation, someone, maybe it was yourself, Jhinuk, had asked how this has affected the way we kind of think about our work and access. And there's just like quite concrete things that are small that we can absolutely do, like printing things on pink paper for dyslexic individuals, and having sort of a content not warning, but just letting people know. And it's something that we generally do because we're a small space anyway, and at the front desk people are generally very verbal with people coming in and saying hello and just giving them a few sentences, short sentences on what's there. But there was just these little markers, I think, in this project that we will definitely take forward: the larger print, the pink sort of paper and all that. Yeah, so thank you so much for that. I have a couple of questions left here. I think they are meant for maybe wrapping up towards the end, which was about sort of the next steps of the project. So do we want to take this time first to maybe open it up to conversation before we do that? Yeah. So I had mentioned in the chat a little bit earlier that if anybody had anything in mind, oh, here's one, please do feel free to just chime in the chat, as well as if you want to turn on your cameras now and just wave at us and let us know verbally as well what you would like to ask. But oh, hello. Hi, Kath. So I guess, Kath, you just wrote something in the chat. Would you like to just maybe ask the question yourself and add anything else you might want?
Yeah. Hi, it's actually Lydia on Kath's computer. Hence, I was a bit late joining because of the tech problems. Yeah, it's just thinking about the kind of that impact of sharing. This is kind of a collaborative piece, a workshop. It's not solo, and I'm just thinking of being in a more secular society, so the less people are religious, and that might have been a obvious kind of port of call for people who are bereaved to just be in a particular space, to have discussions, have one-to-one discussions, have group discussions, sing, all those kind of rituals. It just came to me at some point when you're talking about it, it just feels like, is that more relevant now, in a more secular society? Thoughts?
Yeah, I think you're very right. I suppose not only is it a greater degree of secularism, but maybe a greater kind of disconnection from one's immediate community. So I'm a Quaker, so I do have a kind of religious background, although I would maybe describe myself as like spiritual non-theist. So when I was going through grief and bereavement, I did actually have a kind of faith-led community who were there for me on many occasions. So yeah, like yeah. Anything you'd like to say?
I don't know. I think in a way with this project, we were quite conscious of religion and how like the role that traditionally plays within grief, but we almost wanted to engage with grief outside of that experience. Yeah, like we had one of the workshop participants spoke a bit about his faith, and how that had helped him, but also how it hadn't helped him, and some of the kind of contradictions of having a faith and having grief, and where they really contradict each other. So I think it's quite a complicated experience to, yeah.
I guess like maybe, don't necessarily have the answers, haven't had the answers for this whole project, to be honest, but I suppose the thing that maybe we have sort of tried to create or reach for or have felt in need of has been other people. It's been community. It's been a willingness to share openly and be vulnerable together. And we end the publication with a small kind of quote that talks about how dealing with grief is about or necessitates the kind of holding of space for the unfixable. And I think that religion perhaps does that, hold space for the things that aren't fixable, doesn't necessarily offer solutions or whatever. I suppose heaven's a solution, but
it's a different topic.
Yeah.
I think creating community is the kind of driving force, and wherever that's found, I think, I don't know where I'm going with that, but
Jhinuk, did you want to add something?
Yeah, I was just going to add, maybe it feels a bit too general to say this, but I do remember when we were talking about how you would how you would receive responses to questions that you might not be expecting. So, putting religion within that and thinking like cultural practices and different cultural ways of thinking permeating into different faiths and beliefs. I think one thing that you two did very well was to try and figure out how you would navigate around uncomfortable responses or where the boundaries were, and that's why it was important to have Josh in the room as like extra support that kind of could answer towards more specific things. But I think maybe if there were more intense faith and religious kind of discussions, that could have gone a different way. I think it was interesting that you were, working with a collective response of different participants of your workshops. If you did it again, you might have different phrases and
Yeah,
shape
totally.
of canopy and things like that. So that's what makes it special, I think.
Thank
Thank you
you.
for your question as well.
Yeah, really good
Yes,
question.
thank you. Thank you. So if I can ask Stuart to go next, then Caroline, and then we have one final or two questions in the chat. Okay.
Oh,
I didn't have a question. I mean, I can make a response, but I didn't actually have a question that was in the chat. If someone else has that.
Okay, so maybe Caroline can ask the question, then we can leave some of the.
Apologies, nor did I. I just had my camera on out of politeness.
Yeah, I put my camera on because you said put your cameras on and say hello. So that's
Yeah.
Oh,
Nice.
hello. That's totally fine. I was just what I'd meant, which I probably wasn't clear enough, was that if you wanted to ask a question, then you can turn cameras on. But you're absolutely welcome to leave your cameras on now when it's an open discussion anyway, so that's fine. Yeah. So maybe Ruth, did you have a question?
I mean, maybe Anna wants to go first, just because she popped a question in before mine. Want to give her space to do that.
Hi. Hi there, yeah. I just wrote a question here that I'm really kind of interested in your role as kind of editors or kind of mediators of individual and collective experience that you're bearing witness to. I'm just interested to hear about your experience of making decisions about how to work with the sort of testimony, words, experiences of other people. Yeah, like you spoke a little bit about presenting an amalgamation of things. Yeah, I'd just like to hear a bit more about that.
No, that's a thanks for bringing that up. It's a good thought. The reason why we amalgamated the experiences, it's kind of two reasons. One, we didn't want to put ourselves in the position of looking like we were kind of like the figureheads or the spokespeople of grief and all grieving experiences, because it's so varied from person to person and also within that person's lifespan. And we amalgamated them because we didn't want anyone that had attended the workshops to have the potentially upsetting or uncomfortable experience of coming to the exhibition and seeing a direct quote from them, and feeling in some way like, I don't know, like robbed of the intimacy of that moment, because it was quite important to us that the workshops were a kind of standalone intimate event. So we communicated to everyone that we would be amalgamating these phrases, we'd be recording the conversations, but there would be no direct quotes, and we asked for permission for that. Yeah, it was to kind of safeguard people a little bit.
And then I suppose just to kind of build a little bit on what Em was saying, the process was we had audio recordings and we had notes and worksheets that people had taken. Then it was a case of us basically sifting through them and looking for common themes, what was coming up multiple times, where were similar things being said, and how could those be brought together in one way or another. And if you have the chance to have a look at the physical or digital publication, you'll see that there are sections where there are pages with multiple speech bubbles, where there's this kind of sense of a polyphony, multiple voices speaking, and they don't necessarily always speak in harmony. There is contradiction, there is back and forth. So in trying to represent what was being shared, it wasn't all one note, I suppose. So yeah, we were trying to be conscious and conscientious editors as best as we could, I suppose. I think there's perhaps more that we could do with hindsight, and there's more that we'll do in the future. but it's certainly something that we've been thinking about throughout. So thank you for your question, Anna, and unless there's something you're going to add.
No, that's it.
Cool.
Thanks very much.
Thank you. And Ruth, would you like to ask your own question?
Yeah, yeah, it's great hearing you talk more about this project, and perhaps it props to Josh Hart. What a total legend.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's really funny hearing his name known since he was like 12-year-old boy. Just wanted you to reflect a bit on what you think, because I'm kind of on this journey as well, like what you think creative grief practice and workshops that invite people into that space have to offer in terms of opening up how people do grief, I guess. And I think the kind of collective communal element is really essential part of that, and is something I think about a lot as well in my own work. But yeah, would just love to hear you reflect on the kind of powerful opportunities that creative grief practice kind of has to offer people everywhere.
Josh actually said something which answers your question really well. So he said that, like, obviously the tendency with this isn't a diss on counselling. Counselling has really transformed me, and I don't think I would be able to have this conversation without the help of several counsellors. But with the grieving experience, it's a situation where grief makes you feel isolated and disjointed from the world. So then when you go and see a counsellor, you're again on your own with that counsellor. So this is, alongside of that, a really helpful way of furthering that conversation and allowing a space for that communal, collective experience of grief where you can feel less alone. But I wouldn't say it's like an antidote to a counselling experience. I would say it's like a complementary, a bonus. Yeah, just allows different experiences.
Mm. Yeah, I guess there's a risk as well, or it's like, and presenting it in that way is really helpful, where like you've had the counselling training but you're not offering a therapeutic, like professionally therapeutic space. I think that's a really important distinction to make, isn't it? It's like space for exploration and conversation, but you're not a therapist, and you don't, you know, because I think that can be quite harmful sometimes, can't it, if people are like expecting something that it's not. And yeah,
so we tried to be super clear about what we were offering, and saying, you know, yes, we are not therapists, we are artists, and this is what we're doing, and this is what we are able to offer you. So yeah, super important to be able to draw that distinction, and having Josh there with us was also super important to kind of have that that support from him. Also, mental health services should just across the country be better funded. There should be more access to counselling services, whether that be and artists shouldn't be there to prop up that. I was thinking similarly, because, like, you know, over the last decade there's just been such a gutting of all public services, like across the board. And this should be, you know, one teeny tiny strand of a much wider, fully kind of built out type of sort of public service community kind of thing that makes space for people to address their grief. Because what we're doing, you know, it works for us, it works for some, if not all, of the people who kind of came to the sessions, but it's not necessarily something that's going to appeal to everybody. So yeah, it's kind of really broad approach. So trained professionals. Yeah. So tax the bankers, take away the bonuses, and fund the NHS. Thanks very much.
Amen. Thank you.
Can I add something to that? I think that like what you did was like provide space for permission to be individual in your grief practices as well, because once you start opening up those spaces and seeing how different people responded with different phrases, different ways of interacting with your workshop or the space or with the publication, I think it just provides a bit more openness to the fact that you can be as individual and weird or traditional or yeah, as you want to be with your grief. And I think that's the advantage of doing that in response to Ruth's question.
That's way of phrasing it.
Yeah.
Yeah, that is a fantastic way of phrasing it. I think I love the question, Ruth, of the oh, was it you actually, Ruth? Maybe it was earlier, but the mention of rites and rituals, and I think these can be very personal things as well as collective. So yeah, that was a great way of a great addendum. Thanks, Jhinuk. And then Kelly, I don't know whether you want to turn on your camera, Kelly. You can ask it yourself. If not, then I'd be happy to ask it on your behalf. No? Okay, I'll ask it then. Great, Kelly. If you were to do this again or something similar, what might you do differently? What was your biggest takeaway from all of the sessions?
I would give us more time, which sounds ridiculous because we had a lot of time. We've been having this conversation with Sunshine for 2 years at this point. Yeah, like it's working with grief is a slow process in a creative practice, and you need to, I think we needed to factor in a bit more room for just like not dealing with it for a while and having more regular breaks and not looking at our loss so closely on a weekly basis.
Yeah, I think more time definitely important. I would like to have held more workshop sessions, and it would have been great if we could have worked with a sort of similar kind of overlapping group of people on multiple occasions. But just kind of the nature of things is that people are busy, there's a lot going on in their lives. They personally may not necessarily want to be attending multiple workshops to do with their grief. So that's something that that I would have liked to have done more of. I feel as though the conversations that we were having were the thing that were really enriching the project. So I would have liked more of that. And then in terms of the biggest takeaway, the thing that immediately came to mind, and it's not selfish, but it's to do with me and my experience, that I'm less alone in my grief, that I'm less of a kind of weirdo, that my feelings are feelings that other people are having, that the things in my grief that I've experienced that felt strange or not so human or whatever are human experiences, because I've been in rooms full of humans who've done, felt, said all those same or similar things. So yeah, my biggest takeaway is feeling like I'm more of a human in my grief, I suppose.
Yeah, can't say it better than that.
Wonderful. Jhinuk, would you like to add anything as well?
I think I would say exactly the same thing, but from my perspective, like when Emily and Chris both contacted me, it was so serendipitous because I was raw in grief, and I think it was like a lifesaver. So it was really nice to have this opportunity to be a part of this. Yeah.
Appreciate you.
Thank you, Jhinuk. Yes, and Stuart had a question there as well. Would you like to read that out yourself, Stuart, or shall I do it for you?
Yeah, sure. No, I was thinking with my own experience of grief, which was many years ago, I didn't have, for me, the grief was very emotional and very individual, but what I felt I was missing was mourning. And for me, kind of grief is a very intimate an individual experience, whereas mourning somehow was more social, more collective, and me about being in mourning is how I wanted people to know that I was in mourning, in that kind of visible, performative, this is who I am when I'm outside of my safe space kind of thing. And I felt that the mourning thing was it. So I was just wondering your views, if I apologize if it takes us off topic a little, but kind of that relationship between, it came up a little bit with a previous question about the kind of collective and the individual, and whether you had any thoughts about the relationship between grief and mourning.
It's we definitely touched upon to then. So when we were hosting the textile workshops, we were in that kind of like Victorian mourning tradition. We were inviting people to make textile patches, textile armbands, which kind of had a relationship to the person's grief. We tried not to be super prescriptive. We weren't going to say, you must make your patch to these kind of instructions and it must fit this definition, but people largely used them to sort of commemorate a person who had died that they loved through a mixture of words and symbols. So I suppose that was definitely an area where we were overlapping with this idea of mourning. And I thought it was interesting what you said about it. It kind of made me think about, I suppose, the sort of exceptional quality of mourning, exceptional in the sense of a period of exception where you could signify to the world that I am in mourning, something has happened in my life, and I need the world to be aware of it because I need, and this is a phrase from the Canopy, I need the world to be gentler. So I think that's really interesting. We haven't really talked about mourning in the project, but I think inadvertently we've ended up in small ways overlapping with that.
We did have conversations in some of the workshops, especially the textile one, about how there's like an expected time frame that other people have for your grief. And I guess during, like, in our culture, the mourning period is in between the death and the funeral. And then after that, you're expected to like go back to work, go back to normal, and not really speak about it. So yeah, we talked about these expected projected timeframes that other people have, and how grief is obviously quite, in our experience, quite stretchy and elastic and lasts a lifespan as well. But definitely like how culture can change the expected mourning period, because like my best friend is Muslim, and he has like, there's like different like every year people get together and celebrate again. So there's these returning points where in other cultures where you would collectively mourn and readdress that mourning period.
Yeah.
But I really like your description of how mourning and grief are separate. That's something I've not really thought about in that nuance before. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Jhinuk, would you like to add anything? You don't have to.
No, I was just thinking the same thing that you just added, Emily, that yeah, there's different time frames, and some felt, for me, culturally, for example, in my family, like some things happen really quickly, like the funeral, like is expected to happen within the next 24 hours, which feels really, really tight and, you know, a little bit frantic. But then other things are slower and gentler and last, yeah, maybe a lifetime. And it's expressed in different ways. So I guess my mum completely changed her diet after my dad passed away as a sign of mourning, and it was for life, you know. So there's different things culturally that yeah, can be considered, and that's quite interesting to think about. So yeah, thanks for bringing that nuance up.
Yeah.
Yes. And finally, the last question is from Caroline. If you would like to read this out yourself. Okay, great.
Hi, thank you very much for today. It's been really wonderful. I've only experienced your exhibition in the virtual because I'm working with grief down in West Cornwall. I'm really interested in how the exhibition space, once you weren't running workshops in it, how it worked to I suppose to generate conversation and the experience in the gallery. Did people want to stop and talk, and how did you facilitate that?
Sunshine, you appear to have your hand up. You're probably the best placed person to speak about.
Yeah, I thought maybe I could do that because I'm there every day and I kind of see people coming in and how it lands with people. So I've been sort of slowly trying to, with the help of the invigilators as well, just give them kind of a lead in on how to I guess, hold a person's hand as they come through the door and lead them into the gallery, metaphorically, not so much physically. Sometimes physically, if people really need mobility support as well, and that's also something I'm learning about access. But yes, there are certain things that we try to prepare people for when they come through the door to set the scene. Definitely, I've been encouraging the invigilators to speak up to them already without having them to approach us and say hello. And we've got a sign saying that this exhibition is about grief and about bereavement and loss. I asked them to reinforce that by saying that out loud to visitors. We have on the handouts as well as on the sign a grief hotline number, just in case anything within the space might be might awaken something in people. We have the zine as well as which includes all the recipes and things that Emily and Chris have mentioned earlier as well, reflections from the workshops, all of these things that we put in the space so that besides the canopy and sitting down to look at all the phrases that are embroidered in this beautiful piece, they also have some reading material so they can sit in the space a bit longer. And what we've noticed is that people's average stay in the gallery has been really quite long. It's a small space. It's probably, you know, the size of 2 bedrooms, maybe 2 medium size front living rooms. So it's not that big, and it feels even more hunkered down with the lowering of that huge canopy. So it just holds you quite well, and we have 3 windows that you overlook into a set of artist studios. So I think people are happy to just sort of get lost in a moment and look out the window, look up at the canopy, look at the reading materials, and they stay for a good 35 minutes. You know, that's a rough estimate. So that's how we facilitate. And then when people leave, we say goodbye, just make sure they're okay, like see if they're feeling it, you know, if there's any wobbliness. We also have in the front reception area a station for free teas and coffees, and a bench, so that people, if they just need somewhere else to be but not enter the street space straight away to walk back to work, there's almost this sort of like in between space of just having a sit down and drinking a cup of coffee. So I think that's also been helpful to, again, like not many people have used it, but it's similar to what and Chris have said about having Josh there in the room. It's just the presence of these things that enable the space to do what it does, we hope. So yeah, I hope that answers your question. So yes, I think that's all the questions answered. I just want to thank everyone tonight for taking the time, especially to our three speakers, Chris, Emily, and Jhinuk, for taking the time to share so many amazing thoughts about the process of the work, which, as Emily mentioned earlier, was quite a long process of about 2 years before we got to this point. So yeah, just thank you, everybody. If you have any comments, further questions, please put them in the chat. If you came on through Eventbrite, then with the artist's permission, I would be able to forward you the contents of the chat if you would like to receive that. And as long as I get nods from Jhinuk, Emily, and Chris about that, yeah, great, thumbs up. And I'll just go ahead and send them to you. If you didn't get here through Eventbrite and just through the link on our website, please, if you want a copy of this, just leave your email in the chat as well, and I'll make sure to get that across to you. Otherwise, thank you, and have a lovely evening. Oh yeah, in the spirit of what Emily said, I hope you think of something to do tonight. Oh, the questions. We didn't even get back to the last 2 questions, did we? But I think that's okay. It feels like it's come to a nice point. So yes, do think of something to do that's restorative after this, maybe tomorrow morning, or yeah, but do find some way of maybe unraveling some of the things from tonight, so that you can enter tomorrow with a fresh state of mind. So bye everybody. Emily, Chris, and Jhinuk, please stick around just so I can check in with you. But everybody else, good night.
Thank you, everyone.
Yeah, thanks so much for coming and listening and for your questions.
Yeah.
Thank you.